Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, The Skeptic and The Shrink, the psychologist's case for skepticism. In this video, we're going to be looking at the Dunning-Kruger Effect, or why you are less capable than you think, or why you might be less capable than you think, and how you can't really tell how capable you are. So, imagine you are about to take a test. Think in your mind of the answers to two questions. First, how well do you think you will do on that test? And second, based on the prediction you just made, how well do you think you can predict your own results on the test? According to the Dunning-Kruger Effect, someone that will fail the test will grossly overestimate their own ability to perform. The better they are at taking the test, the more accurate their prediction will be, until you get to the point of the top about quarter of performers, who will slightly underestimate their ability to perform. Now, you might think that everyone simply felt that they would pass the test, as many of the overestimations were just above passing. People feel awkward saying that, oh, I'm going to get a 10% out of 100 on a test. They might say, oh, I'll just barely pass. And since many of them did end up failing horribly, those estimations of just barely passing were gross overestimations of how they did. However, this trend was also seen in the ability to correctly predict such things as how well their college debate team will perform in a competition. The very poorly performing teams grossly overestimated how well they would do, when there was no sense of passing or failing. Or a hunter's ability to answer questions about firearm regulations, participants' ability to judge funny jokes, write grammatically correctly, and, most importantly for this video, think logically. This effect was seen in people's ability to use logic and to identify valid and sound arguments. So the graph comes out something like this. In all of these situations, participants who performed poorly drastically overestimated their ability, while participants who performed well slightly underestimated their ability. So we have over on the left the bottom quartile, and you see the actual results for all of these things were much lower than the predictions. The lower quartile, you get a little bit better. The upper quartile is getting close to being able to correctly predict their results. And the top quartile has their results actually being higher than how they predicted they would do. This means that the worse you are at a particular task, the more you will overestimate how good you are at that task. As before, with skepticism, we're not going to be demonstrating that this in some way proves skepticism, that this is a valid deductive argument, but rather, we're going to be offering kind of an alternative explanation for why people might overestimate their abilities. Why, if we are in fact in a skeptical scenario, would so many people be convinced that we are not? Because, if we are in a skeptical scenario, then all of us are quite ineffective at determining what is true and what is justified. So if we tested the ability to tell what is true and what is justified, then we would all be falling down on that very low levels of ability. And therefore, we're going to be grossly overestimating our own ability to perform this task. So, if in fact we're in a skeptical scenario, we're all going to be very bad at estimating our own ability to judge whether something's justified or whether something's true, and therefore will grossly overestimate that ability and think that we have justified true beliefs, when in fact we don't. Now, this might also make you start to doubt your own claims about logical truths. I often get questions of, oh, how can you doubt something like the law of the excluded middle, or the law of identity? Well, we can go into logical arguments for things like non-classical logic. Here we're going to address the question of not whether a particular truth of logic holds, but rather whether you can apply it correctly, or that you understand it well enough such that your beliefs about it are true. If you do not in fact understand how to use that logical truth, then you will not only fail at using it and therefore have it be based around untrue beliefs or it itself be unjustified, but you'll probably be convinced that you can use it correctly, because you're going to fall once again at the bottom of that scale and grossly overestimate your own ability. The fact that you cannot use it correctly makes it so that you are blind to your own inability. So you may believe that the law of identity says one thing when in fact it says something completely different. So even though you seem to believe in the law of identity, you actually believe in something else that you refer to as the law of identity, and think that it is bestowed with all of these great qualities of being a fantastic logical truth, when in fact you're believing that about something completely different because you failed at being able to identify what the law of identity is, or being able to understand really what is the law of identity. Hopefully, to make a little more sense of this, we're going to look at it like this. Imagine there are two people that are both convinced that they are decent logicians. The problem is that one of them is actually horrible at logic, but because of the Dunning-Kruger effect is convinced that they are a decent logician. The other is, in fact, a fantastic logician, and because of the same effect, underestimates their own ability. So the one over here overestimates their ability, while the one over here underestimates their own ability. The problem is that from the first-person perspective, if you're one of these logicians, you can't tell which you are. Because from your perspective, either way, you appear to yourself to be decent at logic. You can't tell if your beliefs about logic are in fact justified because you are the one that's fantastic at logic, or unjustified because you're incapable of doing logic and that causes you to have the belief that you're decent at logic. Because from the first-person perspective, you can't tell if you're the horrible logician or the fantastic logician, that means that your beliefs about the law of the excluded middle or the law of identity or other logical rules and how to apply them don't count as justified, it would seem, because there's no way for you to discount the possibility that you could be the horrible logician. And based on the Dunning-Kruger effect, a lot of people overestimate their abilities. And even if you are convinced that you're the good logician, then you might just be subject to optimism bias, since there is no rational way to determine which one you are, and you're just thinking, oh, bad things don't happen to me, this doesn't apply to me, I'm clearly the one that's fantastic at logic. So, the point here is the Dunning-Kruger effect creates the problem between a separation of perception of ability and actual ability at a particular task. Someone that performs very poorly at a task and someone that performs very well at a task may actually estimate their ability is within a much closer range than it actually is. And so from a first-person perspective, you can't tell very well if you are actually very, very bad at a particular task. And if that task is doing logic or making valid arguments, this poses a huge problem for someone that thinks that we're all lovely, rational machines that will always see the rational conclusion to a particular argument. Now, overall, it might seem strange to someone just coming into philosophy that the skeptic has doubts when so many people are convinced that they have knowledge. Yet, people form beliefs about their own effect on the world, not based on their actual effects on the world, but based on the perceived positive or negative outcomes of their actions. If something good happens, you assume, oh, clearly I did that. If something bad happens, you blame someone else. And they fail to realize that they were just ineffective at forming these beliefs, since they overestimate their own ability to form true beliefs. So they ignore some of those problems because they say, well, clearly I'm better than I actually am at forming true beliefs. If they're bad at forming true beliefs, as we just showed most people are. And they then reinforce these irrationally arrived at and confirmed beliefs by searching for, interpreting, and remembering only evidence that then supports their beliefs and ignoring any evidence that discredits those beliefs. And finally, when they're presented with this very information that shows how bad they are at creating true beliefs and creating justified beliefs, they assume that this is only something that happens to other people, and in fact, they are exempt from it. The point here is that you may be like most people and dismiss these effects, because even though, in fact, they do happen to the majority of people, you're clearly in the completely rational minority. However, I challenge you to be brave, doubt your most closely held beliefs, and conquer these cognitive biases. Because, as we've noted before, you're not going to be subject to things like confirmation bias if you don't have any beliefs to begin with. That was the Dunning-Kruger Effect, and that concludes for now our series, The Skeptic and the Shrink. We may bring this series back, so if you have any ideas of other psychological effects that may help us be pushed more towards skepticism, please offer them in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.